The 4-minute film clip you're about to see seems to me one of the most remarkable examples in the history of cinema of music wedded to the moving image. A community of poor Mexican fishermen unites, storms the city where their fish are sold at a great profit, of which they get practically nothing. Their leader has just been murdered. See what you think. So that's the ending of the film Redes, 1936. The cinematographer is Paul Strand, one of the great names in the history of photography as an art form. The composer is Silvestre Revueltas, who deserves to be as well known as Paul Strand, and yet is not. His dates are 1899 to 1940. Why is this movie so little known is a question that needs answering, and I would say there are two answers that are obvious. The first answer is, it's not an American movie, which is to say one made in the United States. It's not a European movie. It's a Mexican movie. That's one answer. And the other answer, which will not be obvious to you from the film clip, is that the soundtrack was very hastily recorded. That's to say the musical soundtrack was hastily recorded, and the sound isn't very good. What you just saw and heard is the film with a newly recorded soundtrack, newly performed by PostClassical Ensemble, conducted by Angel Gil-Ordonez. Its origin is a Naxos DVD, which we created 4 years ago as part of a series of Naxos DVDs with famous films from the 1930s, with the soundtracks newly refreshed. The other films in this series are The Plow That Broke the Plains and the River, both products of the New Deal, famous documentaries from 1936 and 1938, and The City, a classic 1939 documentary made for the New York World's Fair of 1939. These films comprise a tetralogy. They're all 1930s political films. On the left, The Plow That Broke the Plains was made for the New Deal by Pere Lorenz. He directed it with music by Virgil Thompson. The River, 2 years later, again directed by Pere Lorenz with music by Virgil Thompson. The City was scripted by Louis Mumford with music by Aaron Copland. And Redes, as I've said, is scored by Silvestre Revueltas. The camera is handled by Paul Strand. There are two directors. One is Fred Zinnemann, who's en route to Hollywood from his native Austria, and the Mexican Emilio Gomez Muriel. I call this a tetralogy because these films actually have overlapping participants. They influence one another. Paul Strand also works on The River. Willard Van Dyke, a great name in the history of documentary film, works both on The River and The City. Pere Lorenz, in addition to directing The Plow That Broke the Plains and The River, had a hand in the script for The City. And Aaron Copland, in addition to scoring The City, happened a few years before that to review Redes for the New York Times. Another common element in these four films is that the composers are all striving to use music in new ways to accompany a film. They've been influenced, the films in general are influenced by Soviet film, by Eisenstein, by the use of montage and visual metaphor. And they're inspired by their knowledge that in Russia, the major composers, including Shostakovich and Prokofiev, are film composers. I would say that the relevance of this film today, Redes, when we're in the midst of a worldwide viral pandemic, is pretty obvious. All four of these films respond to a state of emergency. The Plow That Broke the Plains and the River are Depression-era films. One is a response to flooding on the Mississippi Delta and what to do about it. The other is a response to the Dust Bowl and what to do about that. In the case of The City, you have a film about urban malaise and unemployment, and it too recommends a way of fixing the problem. And finally, in the case of Mexico, we have a condition of chronic social and economic inequality, and the remedy is revolution, workers uniting and storming the bastions of power. The arts are peculiarly pertinent in such times. They serve as a source of inspiration, a source of edification, and indeed, one could say that all four of these films exemplify art as propaganda at a very high level. The film you're watching right now both celebrates and remembers Redes, and it also asks a question, which is, what is the significance of Redes and other cultural products of the Mexican Revolution today, both within the long trajectory of Mexican history and culture, and also at a time when culture is newly challenged by a worldwide epidemic. As a starting point, it's worth remembering that it wasn't just Paris and Berlin that were meccas for artists and intellectuals in the 20s and 30s. It was also Mexico. Mexico was in the throes of cultural renewal driven by social and political aspirations, and Mexican artists felt empowered by the challenge at hand. It was a time of intense cultural ferment in Mexico, in literature, in music, in the visual arts. The Americans who flocked to Mexico included Paul Strand and Aaron Copland, also Langston Hughes, also John Steinbeck. When Copland arrived in the 30s, he wrote home to friends to say that he was feeling jealous.
When I was in Mexico, I was a little envious of the opportunity composers have to serve their country in a musical way. When one has done that, one can compose with real joy. Here in the USA, we composers have no possibility of directing the musical affairs of the nation. On the contrary, I have the impression that more and more we are working in a vacuum.
Copland in Mexico came to know Carlos Chavez, who was the most prominent Mexican composer. Chavez was the director of the National Conservatory of Music and later would be the director of the Institute of Fine Arts and of what became the most important Mexican symphonic orchestra, which he also conducted. And Copland met Diego Rivera, he met Frida Kahlo, artists whose paintings and murals expounded a bold post-colonial Mexican identity. The same remarkable generation of Mexican artists produced the murals of Jose Clemente Orozco and of David Alfaro Siqueiros, also the paintings of Rufino Tamayo. In this company, Silvestre Revueltas was also an artist who empathized with the oppressed and with the virtues of stoic dignity and earthy exuberance. Of Revueltas, the master Mexican poet Octavio Paz wrote,
Silvestre era un campo de batalla. Jamás se hizo traición y jamás traicionó la verdad contradictoria, dramática de su ser. Mira, en Silvestre vivían muchos interlocutores, muchas pasiones, capacidades, debilidades, finuras. Esta riqueza de posibilidades, de adivinaciones y de impulso es lo que da a su obra, la más importante de América, ese aire de primer acorde, de centella escapada de un mundo en formación. Toda su obra está presidida por algo que no es la alegría, como creen algunos, ni la sátira o la ironía, como creen los demás. Este elemento, el mejor y más puro, es la piedad. La alegre piedad frente a los hombres, los animales y las cosas. Por la piedad, la obra de este hombre, tan desnudo, tan indefenso, tan herido por el cielo y los hombres, sobrepasa la música de hoy. Y ocupa en el corazón de nosotros un lugar superior al de la grandiosa pintura mexicana, que lo conoce todo, menos la piedad. Ni en Orozco, ni en Siqueiros, ni en Diego hay simpatía alegría o piedad.
Early in the film Redes, we saw a Revueltas compassionate and empathetic with those who are suffering, those with whom he immediately is connected to. This example is the beautiful funeral of his son, is this beautiful dirge. In the image before, we saw the poor main character of the film, Miro, asking for some help to his patron, and of course not getting any money for medication or for bringing his son to the hospital. So the song dies, and this incredible, beautiful funeral march, dirge, happens next in the film. This is probably one of the most extraordinary pieces of music in the whole film. I think it's a beautiful musical poem.
No es justo que un hijo muera porque su padre no tuvo dinero para curarlo.
Redes is not a polished film. It's not even a finished film. One could say it's as unfinished as the Mexican Revolution itself. All the actors but one are non-professionals. Most of them are actual fishermen from the region of Veracruz. There was constant fighting between Revueltas and Strand because Revueltas wanted his music to have its own autonomous identity. In fact, he began composing the music before he'd seen any of the rushes, which was unnerving for Paul Strand. What they had in common was that they were both political actors on the left. They were politically kindred. So they jointly created this film, which is disappointed with the outcome of the Mexican Revolution and argues for organized resistance as a necessary means of political reform. Strand creates a visual poem of stark light and shadow, clouds and sea, palm fronds, thatched huts. And wedded to that is this amazing soundtrack which throbs with the hardship and heroism of challenged lives. It's a sound film, but stretches of it, really the most memorable stretches, are shot without sound, including the two sequences we've already seen, the beginning of the film and the end of the film, and also what we're about to see, the centerpiece of the film, the exhilarating 6-minute sequence where the fish come in. Redes means nets, and this is a metaphor for ensnared lives. Revueltas furnishes a musical theme, a leitmotif for nets. It's a tolling theme, 3 notes in the brass. We hear it immediately at the beginning of the film, and then near the beginning of the film again, when we first see a net, we hear the theme once more. So this opening of the film, which we'll see right now, not only presents the film as a story, but Revueltas is presenting us the musical materials which he will deploy in his symphonic score. So now we get to the central sequence, really, I would say the peak sequence in this film. There have been no fish. And then suddenly the fish come in and the fishermen go out to catch them. And in this sequence, there's an elaborate play of metaphor. There are the nets, and when we see the nets, we hear the theme, the musical theme for nets. And then the montage tells us that the fishermen, like the fish, are entrapped. And then Strand ingeniously fixates on the veins of the fisherman's arms and discovers there something like the ropes of the nets. The result is an epic portrait, I would say, of pride and resilience in the face of adversity.
Revueltas' story is fascinating. The early history of Revueltas is what informs the later Revueltas, in that he comes from a very humble background. Very much a working class family, struggling just to get him music lessons. And I should mention that Revueltas is only the first of 12 children in a family, 4 of whom would go on to become major contributors in the arts. We have Revueltas. We also have his brother Jose, who would become a novelist, Rosaura, who would become an actress, and Fermin, who would become a major muralist.
And here's Rosaura, his sister, talking about her brother Silvestre. Okay. Silvestre began to learn violin when he was 5 years of age. Do you know what that means? If you consider that my father and mother were very simple people who had always lived in a small mining town, who had no culture and a very slight instruction. But they were extraordinary people too. Both possessed an innate intelligence and sensibility. My mother had never read a book or heard other music than that of the small rustic orchestra of the village playing waltzes. So how did this happen?
It's an amazing thing, the impression that a small rustic orchestra in a village can have. And I think this is an important message for educators. You never know, or musicians or artists, wherever they may be, you never know, you plant many seeds and you never know which one of those is going to take root and flower. And it turns out that these very humble musicians playing in the village orchestras of Santiago, Papasquiaro, had a huge impact on Silvestre Revueltas. When he comes to Austin, the idea of a Mexican from a humble background coming to the United States, the capital city of Texas, and finding opportunities to perform, to freelance, which he does. He's a very active violinist, to the extent that his father is paying a pretty sizable sum for his family to attend St. Edward's College. And what Revueltas is really interested in is playing the violin, and he does so, and he's reviewed in the newspapers for doing it, very well received by Austin elites. And for him, that's a point of great pride, and that's what really fuels him. The idea that here's this kid from a real humble background, making a big splash in the capital city of Texas.
Here's a review. Silvestre, not Silvestre.
Silvestre, right?
Silvestre Revueltas, rendered in his usual masterly way. He's already well known. He's, 18 years old? Mm-hmm. The violin solos, which were selected for this occasion. His playing was magnificent, and he took the audience by storm. They followed him through the fiery, passionate abandon of Wieniawski's A la Zingara. They listened in breathless silence to his rendition of the subtle canzonetta, and entered into the intensity of feeling exhibited by his playing of the Romanza Andaluza, a Spanish love song. Yeah. So we have here a young violin virtuoso, not a young composer yet.
Right. Well, it's surprising too. When people think about Silvestre Revueltas, they think about a composer. They don't think about a violinist. So it comes to a surprise to many people that a little bit later, when he's off playing in San Antonio, he's playing a Guarnerius violin, a 17th century Guarnerius violin that's on loan from a Chicago patron. You don't get a 17th century Guarnerius violin just because. I mean, clearly he had impressed people enough in the city of Chicago to merit a loan of that instrument, to return to Texas with it, and to continue his concertizing as a violinist.
It speaks loudly to me that he's a guy who goes to Paris, takes a look, and turns around and goes right back.
Right.
In no way is he a Eurocentric composer. He's an original from our own hemisphere.
Sure. Revueltas is one of those individuals. He's kind of like the fireman of music. You know, a fireman has that peculiarity in that they're trained to go into the danger zones, you know, where everyone else is fleeing. And think about Revueltas. Revueltas, he sees Spanish Civil War going on, so what does he do? He goes he goes there. He's always running into the burning building in many ways. But I think that's an important part of what makes his music so exciting. Whenever we sit and listen to his music, we're there in the burning building with him.
And the flames destroy him.
They did.
He dies at a very young age.
Right.
Disillusioned by the fate of both of these revolutions.
Right.
Well, disillusioned by the fate of the Mexican Revolution, disillusioned by the fate of the Republican government in Spain, and weakened in his health by alcohol. It's a very short and intense life. What was it that Robert Parker said about Revueltas?
Oh, Robert Parker. Yeah, he had this great quote. That Revueltas is Mexico's most famous unknown composer.
Silvestre Revueltas nace en 1899 en la pequeña ciudad de Santiago Papasquiaro, del estado de Durango, y evidentemente lo primero que le llega a sus primeros recuerdos de la infancia son el sonido de las bandas de la ciudad, y ese sonido natural de la música no perfectamente afinada es crucial para sus composiciones posteriores. El sonido de los vendedores de la calle es algo muy, muy importante para él.
Era muy pequeño, 3 años me cuentan, cuando por primera vez oí música. Era una orquestita de pueblo que tocaba la serenata en la plaza. Yo estuve de pie escuchando largo tiempo y seguramente con una atención desmedida, pues me quedé visco. Y visco estuve por 3 o 4 días. De niño, quizá también de hombre, preferí siempre dar tamborazos en una tina de baño y soñar cuentos que hacer algo útil. He tenido muchos maestros. Los mejores no tenían títulos y sabían más que los otros. De allí que siempre haya tenido muy poca veneración por los títulos. Ahora, después de muchos años, sigo estudiando, sigo teniendo maestros, escribo música, sueño con remotos países y a veces doy tamborazos en tinas de baño.
Besides the sound of the bandas in Mexico, the sound of the street cries is also all over the cities, the streets. That also made a huge influence in Revueltas. We are going to hear exactly those street cries in this beautiful song written by Revueltas in 1936 as part of his homenaje a Federico García Lorca. In a wonderful conversation I had with Roberto Kolb, the extraordinary Revueltas specialist and musicologist that has been guiding us for many years in everything Revueltas, the discussion brought us to the topic of how much politics in Revueltas was important. I mean, how extreme he was even able to orchestrate some of the pieces he wrote inspired in the famous Cuban poet Nicolas Guillen. In them, he very clearly uses only instruments that are, so to say, popular instruments, so instruments that appear in the bands that we talked before, the village bands, clarinets, trumpets, double basses. So not, say, bourgeois instruments like the flute or the oboe. So it is a political statement. He's actually using the instruments that the people from the villages, the peasants, play.
Básicamente, pues mi lucha, mi batalla ha sido justamente en contra de la reducción de Revueltas al exoticismo mexicanista, ¿no? Claro. Sí, es cierto que la música suena mexicana, por ejemplo, en este tipo de expresiones, pero ahí lo que importa no es que suene mexicano, claro. Lo que importa es, tú lo estás diciendo, la selección de instrumentos representa la voz de una clase social. Exacto. Y ese es un gesto político, que no tiene nada que ver con la mexicanidad. Para nada. Y ahí sí se podría establecer, esto es tal vez interesante, se me ocurre, un paralelo entre el internacionalismo socialista en su momento, por eso él alude al blues en el caso de la canción de la muchacha negra, o a la música frantillana y caminando, no sé por qué, Sensemayá.
Naxos, ¿no? Federico García Lorca.
Claro, ¿no? Ahí hay una suerte de internacionalismo socialista, pero hay otro internacionalismo, si quieres llamarle así, que es una batalla en donde, por ejemplo, una batalla artística, en donde Revueltas está en el mismo lugar en donde estaban en su época los compositores norteamericanos, buscando también una voz propia, claro, distinta a la del centro europeo, ¿no? Para los mexicanos era fácil reconocer una causa común con Copland, Cowell, ¿no? Con Redes. Para los americanos no era tan fácil darse cuenta que también los mexicanos tenían una apartación y tenían la misma posición fuera del centro, sí, y que tenían algo en común. Y el problema, y eso es lo que yo siempre he buscado, y es lo que creo que ha llegado el momento también, de que en el norte reconozcan que en el sur también hay una voz madura,
Claro.
una voz que puede contribuir al arte, que tiene una causa común, ¿no? Y que no solamente, pues, andamos de taparrabos, ¿no? Que reconozcan
Claro.
eso, ¿no? Y en ese sentido, pues sí hay una causa común.
Another thing Americans up north didn't learn from Mexicans was how to make a place for political art and for political artists. We mentioned before Per Lorenz, who directed The Plow the Broken Plains and the River. His federal film project was terminated by Congress in 1940. We mentioned Paul Strand. He was an expatriate much of his life. He died in France. We mentioned Aaron Copland. Aaron Copland found himself subpoenaed in 1953 by Joe McCarthy and Roy Cohn and asked if he'd ever been a communist. The same year, his Lincoln portrait was dropped from the Eisenhower inauguration because he was regarded accurately as a former fellow traveler on the left. Here's something William Faulkner wrote in 1958. He said, "The artist has no more actual place in the American culture of today than he has in the American economy of today. No place at all in the warp and woof, the thews and sinews, the mosaic of the American dream. Rarely has the White House seemed a home to American artists. Compare that to Mexico, where, say, Carlos Fuentes, arguably the most important Mexican novelist of his generation, was also a Mexican diplomat. And he's not the only such example." So here we have this film, Redes, a political film espousing revolution, and yet sanctioned and paid for by the government of Lázaro Cárdenas, who took office in 1934. How is that possible? What is the historical context here?
Redes was made at a pivotal moment in Mexican history. It illuminates key aspects of that history, and I want to argue history in general. It was made in the early 1930s, after Mexico had experienced a decade of revolution between 1910 and 1920, continuing political and social conflicts in the 1920s, and then was struck by the Depression in 1930. So in the early 1930s, the future of Mexico was still open and uncertain. Sponsored by the government, Redes illuminates the continuing struggles of communities on the land, or in this case, on the water. It proposes that communities, if they organize, if they press hard against local profit seekers and local officials, can claim meaningful gains for their own lives. And it implies, I think, that having been sponsored by the government, that the government will back their efforts. Redes offers thus a key message of Mexican history. And again, I think of all histories. History is not just made by power seekers and power holders, but communities shape their own histories in everyday struggles, and in the effort, they shape larger histories too. Often modestly, but sometimes radically. A survey of Mexico's history since 1900 can tell us a lot. Before 1910, Mexicans lived 35 years of political stability, dynamic economic growth, and deepening social inequities and exclusions. Then the regime broke. And in the breakage of that regime in 1910, 1911, multiple movements broke on the scene. Reformists promoting movements for political reform, more nationalist development, mostly in the North, took the name constitutionalists. Simultaneously, popular movements, the Zapatistas, in communities just south of Mexico City, rose to fight for land. Villistas rose in the north, from the areas near the border in Chihuahua through the regions of Durango. Likely, Revueltas at least knew the reflections of Villismo as he grew up in Durango in that era. When the Depression hit in 1930, the regime aimed to slow the reform explicitly. Communities pressed harder for land and independent lives. And that was the context of Redes. It focused on a fishing community, seeking respect and fair return for the hard lives they lived on the water. The message, I think, was organize. Claim what you can, and the regime will honor you. So Lázaro Cárdenas becomes president in 1934, and he honored the script. He encouraged workers to mobilize and delivered record areas of land. The people continue to make Mexico, to make Mexican history. Now they struggle to do it in an urbanizing world. As globalization constrains national revenues and chances at secure work, people work as they can in families, communities, beyond, to respond to everyday challenges, even as they become deadly in the midst of our pandemic crisis. The message of Redes lives.
Mexican artists have a very long tradition to be involved in not only in revolutions, but in helping the society. I think that artists have really a very, very important role in Mexican society, to not only to express what the people feel, but also trying to understand the society in which we live in. I do believe that contemporary artists in every time in the history are talking to their peers, the people who are living at the same time. So Mexico has always been a very cultural country and always has had very, very revolutionary artists which are talking what the people are really feeling. Maybe that's why, and I do believe that, people in Mexico, and it doesn't really matter what kind of social environment they come from, are very attached to Mexican art.
Redes is now 84 years old. Looking back, it's still being discovered, and Revueltas himself is still being discovered. So it's timely to ask, what does Revueltas say to us today?
Redes es absolutamente contemporánea por dos razones. La primera es porque hace que una historia súper local, en lo micro, como las grandes historias o las grandes historias arquetípicas de una pequeña comunidad, haga algo que refleje a la comunidad global. Es universal porque es súper local. Y el segundo comentario, que creo que es algo que además se está haciendo mucho en el arte contemporáneo, principalmente en el cine, es que Redes se baja del palco. Es una película que se produce a pie de tierra, donde quienes intervienen son ciudadanos de a pie y donde la música no es una música que separe a la alta cultura de la baja cultura, rompe con ese paradigma, con ese planteamiento, para generar precisamente un ejercicio de cultura universal donde esas falsas fronteras se caen. Y creo que ese es su gran acierto y lo que le hace tan contemporáneo hoy.
When I reflect on Redes, it's always been a film and a project that is about building community. And music does that very powerfully. Film does that very powerfully. Pictures do that very powerfully. And the other side of Redes is from the artist's point of view. when it's one of these very accomplished artists getting together to work on a project of great import and of great impact from their points of view, but to take each one of them out of their comfort zones. I think we feel that very palpably right now in the world of Zoom, where artists without orchestras, scholars without audiences, filmmakers without theaters are getting together, getting out of their comfort zone. And I think we're all powered by the very fundamental instincts that also was completely moving Revueltas forward. This instinctive, this primal desire to create and to do something with our art, with our craft, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's stumble, fumble, and clumsy. It's this incredible primal instinct and this need, this drive to create and to have an impact. And I think as artists, as scholars, as educators, we feel that very strongly right now in the era of this pandemic. So while I've always seen Redes as a film about building community, I think more these days I'm looking at it from the actual artist's point of view. Building community as artists on a project of great import in society.
There are two things that strike me as the most extraordinary things about Silvestre Revueltas. One is his extremism as a human being, as a composer, as a militant, a political militant. And the second thing is that he is always on the side of those suffering, on those who are even prosecuted. So it reminds me to a very important composer of the 20th century, who is Dmitri Shostakovich.
Shostakovich, he's a composer who seems in some special way to speak for a community of listeners, a community of feeling, to speak empathetically for an entire nation. Somehow, Revueltas achieves the same feat. In fact, I would say that in my opinion, he's the foremost political composer of concert music produced in the Western Hemisphere.
For me, Revueltas, especially in Redes, shows that Revueltas was a revolutionary, not only a revolutionary musician, a revolutionary in all the sense of the word. What I love about the music of Redes is that we are not listening to some music that is accompanying a visual thing. It's the personage, the male is the music. Miro is the music of Revueltas. And we are really feeling what the main character is feeling. When he has hope, we listen to the hope. And when he's distressed, we can feel that through the music of Revueltas. And I think that is a wonderful thing that he achieved. And I think it's very, very unique also in film music, that you can have this very revolutionary music, wonderfully written, wonderfully orchestrated, and at the same time that throws you into the deepest feeling of the human being.
The message lives in Mexico and elsewhere. We'll organize and we'll press and we'll seek their welfare. And I believe in Mexico, they have been better at that in the course of their history than in many places. And that when artists, whether they are painters, muralists, composers, filmmakers, engage with that and build on it, they work together to have a real impact on society.